Welcome, everybody. We're so happy to see you all here with us today. My name is Laura Seltzer-Dunai, and I am a documentary filmmaker, and I'm also today's guest host for the Sousa Mendes Foundation. I'm proud to say that I'm on the Sousa Mendes Foundation's Educational Committee. And today, we're thrilled to have two accomplished writers, Victoria Riddell and CHANAN TIGAY. And what is kind of nice, what connects all three of us, is that we're all connected to Aristides de Sousa Mendes in one way, shape, or form. I learned about Victoria when I was able to interview her father, who was he was a Holocaust survivor, and he was a refugee who found safety in the US via the steamship Kwanzaa. And so I learned about her when I interviewed her father, as well as for my film, Nobody Wants Us, which was a documentary that some of you may know of. And also I learned about her when she was presenting her book, Border of Truth, which I'm thrilled to announce also that there will be an event where she'll be discussing this book next month. And her father received a life-saving visa, as well as her family, from Aristides de Sousa Mendes. And CHANAN wrote a very impressive article about Sousa Mendes in the Smithsonian Foundation's newsletter that I highly recommend you all check out. My job now is to introduce Victoria, and then she will have the floor. So Victoria Riddell is an author of 3 books of poetry and 5 books of fiction. Her 4th book of poems, Paradise, is coming out in February 2022, next month. So check it out on Amazon or your local bookstores. She's also the recipient of numerous awards, including fellowships from Guggenheim and NEA, and her work has been widely awarded and translated into 10 languages. Riddell's novel Loverboy was adapted for a feature film, and it actually premiered at Sundance, and it was directed by Kevin Bacon. She's taught at Columbia University, Davidson College, Vermont College of Fine Arts, and is on the Sarah Lawrence College for faculty. So without further ado, Victoria, you have the floor.
Hi, it's a real pleasure to be here today and to be in conversation with CHANAN TIGAY about his books. So let me give you just a little sketch of what our time together, CHANAN's and mine, will be. CHANAN will present for a while about his book, and then I'll have the opportunity to ask him some questions. And then it'll move to your questions if you'd like. So at some point, all along the way, if things occur to you, put them in the chat room. I'll have an opportunity when the floor goes back to Laura to look it over. I won't be able to get to all of the questions, but hopefully some relevant questions. So let me give you a little bit of an introduction about CHANAN TIGAY, who's the focus. His work is the focus of today's conversation. CHANAN TIGAY is an author. He's a journalist. He's covered the Middle East, he's covered 9/11 for many journals, for newspapers. He's obviously, as we know, the author of The Lost Book of Moses, The Hunt for the World's Oldest Bible, which is our conversation for today. He taught in the creative writing program at San Francisco State University, which is a wonderful program. He was a fellow of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies, and many more things. As Laura said, the piece that he wrote for the Smithsonian magazine is a really seminal piece of writing on Sousa Mendes. It's really worth everyone checking it out if you haven't already. And then just to round out Laura's sort of connections between all of us in the Jewish geography aspect of this gathering between the 3 of us today. I first met CHANAN because CHANAN has whatever his other accolades are, his greatest fortune is that he's married to the very brilliant writer, Molly Antipole, who's a fiction writer, the author of The Un-Americans. And Molly was my graduate student at Columbia, which is where I first met her. She's also the cousin of my dearest friends. So Hanan and I have connections that aren't entirely literary, but today it's really going to be a pleasure to speak to Hanan about his book. So Hanan, can we just jump right in, and can you tell people a bit of, not everyone will have had the opportunity. I've had to have read the book, give people a sense of the book, and then maybe hopefully read a little bit from the book.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the introduction, Victoria. It's an honor to be here speaking at an event for the Sousa Mendes Foundation, which I respect immensely. And also, of course, to be speaking with Victoria, who just told you we've got a personal relationship. I'll only say, in addition to being a brilliant writer, I know Victoria to be a brilliant teacher, because I've been hearing about her as such ever since Molly started graduate school. So let me begin by telling you a little bit about the book, The Lost Book of Moses. And like so much that happens, I think, in Jewish culture, the story in the book began at the dinner table. My father is a rabbi and a Bible scholar. My mother is a Jewish educator. And we were enjoying a Friday night meal. And I was telling my family about a series of articles I'd been writing about the recent, quote unquote, discovery of Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat in Turkey. You might have noticed that someone somewhere seems to find Noah's Ark just about every year. That discovery, like the rest of them, turned out to be a hoax, and I was writing about it, and I mentioned the articles at dinner, and my father said something along the lines of, well, you want to hear about a real biblical hoax? And he didn't know it then when he said that, neither did I, but that simple question would come to dominate my life for the next 5 years, launching me on a hunt through 8 countries on 4 continents, as I tried to solve the riddle of the enigmatic man at the center of this alleged biblical hoax. And that man was Moses Wilhelm Shapiro, an antiquities dealer from Jerusalem, who in the summer of 1883 shows up on the doorstep of the British Museum in London, claiming to have in his bag the oldest biblical manuscript in the world. Now, Shapiro, who was born as a Jew in Kamenets-Podolsk, but had along the way converted to Christianity, he was by this time very well known to the British Museum, because over the years he'd sold them many, many important and authentic biblical manuscripts. But this manuscript that he showed up with now was very, very different. To begin with, it was extremely old, and it was almost illegible. In fact, Shapiro said it was an original copy of the book of Deuteronomy, the 5th and final of the 5 books of Moses, also known as the Pentateuch or the Torah. His manuscript, he said, was discovered by wandering Bedouin in caves near the Dead Sea. And maybe most interestingly, its text was shockingly different than the traditional biblical text that we're all familiar with. And almost as shocking as that was the fact that Shapiro was asking £1 million sterling for his manuscript. That's about $250 million in today's money, which is much, much more than anyone had ever paid previously for a piece of the past. And so the world freaked out. Shapiro, not only did Shapiro want a wild sum of money for the document, but in 1883, the idea that the Bible as we knew it was very different from the original Bible. This was an explosive proposition to people, right? If the oldest and most original copy of the Bible was different from the traditional text that was used in synagogues and churches around the world, then it stood to reason that the Torah as people knew it hadn't been handed down from God to Moses word for word before the children of Israel crossed into Canaan, as tradition had it. Rather, it indicated that the Torah had changed and possibly had been changed by human hands. So, with his strange and extremely expensive biblical manuscript in tow, Shapiro became an overnight celebrity. Newspapers covered his every move in their literary gossip columns. He was a sought-after dinner guest among England's elite. Back home in Jerusalem, his family was blowing exorbitant amounts of money on credit because they were about to become the richest people in Jerusalem. The Prime Minister of England, William Ewart Gladstone, he himself actually visited Shapiro at the British Museum. And he was so impressed by what he saw that day that he departed the museum and reportedly started raising the funds himself to ensure that England wouldn't lose out on this fantastic relic to its international competitors, Germany and France. And while all this was going on, the British Museum hired one of the great Bible scholars of the day, a man named Christian David Ginsburg, to decipher and transcribe and translate Shapiro's manuscript. And the version of the book of Deuteronomy that Ginsburg found was very, very short, and it was very, very strange. To begin with, there were numerous changes, omissions, and additions to the traditional text, but most radical were the alterations made to the 10 Commandments. These laws, as you surely know, form the foundation of the Judeo-Christian ethic, which today shapes the worldview of nearly a third of the planet's population. I think here you're seeing Mel Brooks demonstrating his own theories on how one might go about changing the 10 Commandments. But in 1883, any changes to the holy text were shocking. But if the 10 Commandments could be altered, moved around, and added to, as they were here in Shapiro's manuscript, everything else in the Torah would seem fair game. Now, in Shapiro's version, the exhortations against worshiping other gods and crafting idols are melded into a single edict, reducing the traditional 10 Commandments to 9 commandments. The scroll's author then adds a new final commandment borrowed from another biblical book entirely. This is Leviticus's well-known exhortation not to hate thy brother in thy heart. And the portion of the commandment in which God vows to visit vengeance on the descendants of idolaters is plucked from its traditional spot in Commandment 2 and moved into number 7, which now threatens such retribution for the descendants of those who make false oaths. And then the 10 Commandments' famous trio of 2-word commandments is expanded by phrases from elsewhere in the Torah. So now instead of the time-honored do not commit adultery, the law reads do not commit adultery with your fellow's wife. Don't murder becomes don't murder the life of your brother. Don't steal is rendered here as don't steal the wealth of your fellow. Now, as he worked away on this manuscript at the British Museum, Ginsburg, the Bible scholar, occasionally stopped to record his discoveries, which he published in the Times of London and in a British magazine of the day known as the Athenaeum. And remarkably, he also used the Athenaeum to publish the text of Shapiro's manuscript itself in Hebrew, which meant that readers of a mainstream English magazine in the summer of 1883 could read and understand biblical Hebrew. So after 4 weeks of excitement, toiling away in the bowels of the British Museum as Shapiro soaked in his newfound celebrity, Ginsburg finished his work and announced his verdict. And it was this: hold your horses. Shapiro's Deuteronomy manuscript is a fake. It's a fraud. And indeed, Ginsburg said the scrolls were not ancient, but rather had been sliced from the blank lower margins of a Torah scroll. You'll see in the picture of the Torah in front of you, there's a blank margin beneath the writing. So what Ginsburg said was Shapiro cut that off and inscribed it with his own version of Deuteronomy. And this argument was bolstered by the fact that as an antiquities dealer, Shapiro had dealt for many years in very old Torah scrolls. And so he would have had access to such material if he wanted to slice off their lower margins. Now, even worse for Shapiro, Ginsburg noted a number of telling spelling errors, which he said pointed to both the geographic origin and the religious faith of the compiler. And he was, Ginsburg said, a Jew from Poland, Russia, or Germany. And the clear implication here was not only that Shapiro's manuscript had been forged, but that Shapiro himself was the forger in chief. I should also mention here that later critics also pointed out a series of grammatical problems in Shapiro's manuscript. And one particularly embarrassing instance where 2 letters switched places, a mistake that left God himself not getting angry, as in the traditional text, but committing adultery. So there you have it. In any case, after his prize manuscript, the relic that was supposed to make him rich and respected, after Ginsburg dismissed it as a forgery, Shapiro was inconsolable. Humiliated, he ran away from England. He didn't contact his family. He is said to have visited a number of European cities, leaving luggage behind at each stop, writing letters, but never mailing them. And then in March of 1884, he took a small room at a seedy little hotel in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. He raised a pistol to his head and he pulled the trigger, ending his life at the age of 54. And people thought that's where the story ended. Shapiro had forged the manuscript. He'd tried to sell it to the British Museum and he'd been caught. precipitating his suicide. But fast forward 70 years to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, considered by many to be the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. Recall now that Shapiro's Deuteronomy was said to have been discovered in a cave. So too were the Dead Sea Scrolls. Shapiro's manuscripts were full of departures from the traditional biblical text. So too were the Dead Sea Scrolls. Shapiro's strips were found by Bedouin wandering the Dead Sea. So too were the Dead Sea Scrolls. Shapiro's manuscript was a copy of Deuteronomy. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, Deuteronomy was the second most numerous book after Psalms. And indeed, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls 6 decades after Shapiro's death had led some scholars to reopen the investigation of his strange Deuteronomy, whose dismissal all those years earlier they now believed might have been tragically premature. It was even possible that Shapiro had found the first Dead Sea Scroll 60 years before the rest. But there was a problem. In the 62 years between Shapiro's death and the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Shapiro's Deuteronomy had mysteriously disappeared. No one knew what happened to it. It had simply vanished from the face of the earth. Now, that's where I come into the picture. Once I heard this story from my father at that Friday night dinner, I decided that I needed to find the missing manuscript and prove once and for all if it was real or fake. And I began in England, where as far as I knew, the scrolls had last been seen in 1883. And then over the course of several more years, I followed clues to Israel and Jordan and Germany and France and the Netherlands. And everywhere I went, I hit brick walls. Documents that were supposed to be there were missing. Others had burned mysteriously in fires. Promising clues turned out to be red herrings. And some people, for reasons that only later became clear to me, were deliberately working to thwart my efforts to find Shapiro's manuscript. The long and short of it is I was failing and I was getting immensely frustrated. I had traveled to all these countries, wading deep into hidden storerooms at the Louvre and musty attics in England, trekking through the flooded Jordanian gorge where the scrolls were said to have been found. But each place I visited, the trail had gone completely cold and I was panicked. I'd sold the book to a publisher and it was coming due, but I had no ending for it. So in short, I was getting very worried. And then out of the blue, on Yom Kippur night, as I was getting ready to leave for the synagogue, I heard the familiar ping of an email on my computer, and being fully addicted to my email, of course, I ran back into my office and found a new note from a man I'd never heard of before, a man named Matthew Hamilton from Sydney, Australia. And what Matthew Hamilton's note said completely rocked me. It said something along the lines of this: "Dear CHANAN, I see you're writing a book about Shapiro. I've spent the last several years researching him, and I recently discovered the name of the person who came to possess the scrolls after they were thought to have disappeared." Now, if this was true, it was enormous. I'd been searching, and here was a stranger writing, and on the holiest night of the Jewish calendar, no less, to let me know that he knew what had happened to Shapiro's scrolls. So I wrote him back and I said, "Dear Mr. Hamilton, how wonderful that you've discovered the name of the person who came to possess the scrolls after they disappeared. Could you please tell me the name?" And then after a brief exchange during which he pointedly did not tell me the name, Matthew Hamilton from Sydney, Australia, proceeded to drop off the face of the earth. He disappeared. He simply never wrote to me again, never responded to my increasingly desperate emails over the course of the next 8 months. So beyond frustrated, I did what any self-respecting journalist would do. I hired a private detective in Australia to try and track Hamilton down. And after 2 weeks, the detective sent me a 52-page report on Hamilton that contained exactly 0 helpful information. There was, for example, a list of 450 other people in the greater Sydney area named Matthew Hamilton, and a brief mention of a job he may once have held in a library 6 or 8 years earlier. So now I was left with a choice. I could quit, or I could get on a plane to Sydney and try to find Hamilton myself and convince him to talk to me. So I bought a ticket to Australia and I flew there, hoping against hope that I might be able to track down Matthew Hamilton. To be perfectly honest, I had no real plan to achieve this. I brought the detective's report with me on the plane, and I intended to spend the flight scouring it for clues, some tiny connection I'd missed, some name that had escaped my notice, maybe a footnote that on the 10th reading illuminated some new idea. So as flight attendants rushed up and down the aisles, instructing passengers to straighten their chairs and turn off their cell phones, I opened up the file. And as a squat little tractor backed the plane away from the gate, and we began the short taxi toward the runway, I reread a brief reference that previously had seemed insignificant to me, out of date. And I'd seen it probably a dozen times already, but now its meaning became clear. Some years earlier, the report noted, Hamilton had been employed by the Moore Theological College, a small Anglican school near Sydney. And just like that, I had a plan. If Hamilton worked at an Anglican college, maybe he was Anglican. And where could I find a nice Anglican guy on Sunday morning when I was landing in Australia? At church. So the minute I landed, I Googled Anglican churches in the greater Sydney area. And within 2 hours, by a stroke of total providence, I had stumbled upon a man named Paul Berenger, who 20 years earlier, it turned out, had served as Hamilton's pastor. And when I told Berenger that I needed Hamilton to track down a missing copy of the world's oldest Bible, he couldn't resist. He said, "This sounds important." He had an old address for Hamilton, 15 or 20 years old, but it was a start. So we hopped into his maroon Nissan to start searching. And we checked churches and houses. We tracked down people who had once known Hamilton, but no one could tell us where he was. So finally, as a last-ditch effort, we decided to go to that 15-year-old address to see what we might find there. And lo and behold, Hamilton answered the door. He greeted Berenger warmly. And when I stepped forward and introduced myself, he invited me right into his house as if he'd been expecting I was going to turn up sooner or later. And there we chatted amiably for a couple of hours. And the whole time, Hamilton was extremely polite and really erudite and completely unwilling to tell me the name of the person who ended up with Shapiro's manuscript. And so when it was time to go, I took a shot in the dark and I invited Hamilton to dinner the following evening. And I think I'll read from the book to take it from here. That evening, Hamilton called up to my room right on time, and I found him in the lobby. We walked together to the near empty hotel restaurant and were seated immediately. In a black sweater, black pants, and glasses, he appeared studious, a look enhanced by the 2 blue loose leaf binders under his arm. The waiter came by and handed us a drinks menu. "It's on me," I said. "Nothing, thanks," Hamilton said. "Nothing? You're sure? A beer?" Hamilton explained that he didn't like beer. On occasion, he told me he'd order a ginger beer. I had discovered a very rare breed, the one Australian who did not drink beer. Beyond appealing to Hamilton's humanity, my plan for this evening included only one other essential component, having a few drinks with this guy in hopes he'd open up. But that plan was now crushed like so many empty cans of Foster's. The waiter went off to fetch dinner menus and bread. "This is for you," Hamilton said. He slid one of the binders across the table. I opened it and began to flip through. It contained 59 pages of his research notes on Shapiro. Printed in a tiny font, the material had been divided into 12 sections, including an extensive bibliography. Chapters included headings like Shapiro, biographical information, genuineness, and what happened to the manuscript after 1883. Each section was methodically detailed, heavily footnoted, and laid out with forethought and clarity. There were charts, photographs, and diagrams. One figure, meant to illustrate how information had passed down from one scholar to another, looked more like schematics for the Airbus A380 than anything to do with the Bible. Hamilton, it seemed to me, had missed nothing. Enthralled by his thoroughness as I paged through the document, I began to notice that certain lines and passages were blacked out. Just a few at first, until toward the end, entire pages were obscured. "You'll notice I redacted any mention of the name," Hamilton said. He had been as thorough in his redaction as in the compilation of this amazing file. Whether it appeared in the text, a chart, or a footnote, every reference to the name or anything that might lead me to it had been covered over. Hamilton ordered the prawn curry. I have absolutely no recollection of what I ate. For the next 3 hours, we talked around the issue. He was generous with his research. Aside from the name, he was willing to divulge and elaborate on everything he had discovered over the course of years investigating Shapiro. The details of what he said were familiar to me, but his analysis was extremely impressive. His familiarity with the literature on Shapiro had allowed him to trace how bits of misinformation had come down to modern investigators like us as received wisdom. I didn't push him to divulge anything more than he was willing. Instead, I expressed genuine astonishment at what he'd accomplished. We finished our entrees and the waitstaff bussed our plates. As we continued talking over the empty table, Hamilton began to let slip little details about the circumstances of his discovery. He had come upon the name, he told me, during a Google search. He began by entering an enormous variety of search terms and combinations thereof: buyer, collector, auction, manuscript, Shapiro, and hundreds, maybe thousands more combined and recombined. He proceeded this way, carefully, methodically, for hours, until finally, one night in November 2011, an intriguing hit popped up in Google Books. It was an obituary that had appeared in an obscure journal having nothing at all to do with the Bible or archaeology. But all Hamilton could see was the brief abstract describing the article, not the article itself. And so he deepened his search, trolling through a mountain of online information for the actual publication to determine if he'd discovered what he thought he'd discovered. At 4 a.m, he found it. And Hamilton told me now, it said exactly what he hoped it would say. The name became the eventual possessor of the notorious Shapiro manuscript. I was stunned. Scholars had been searching for this information for decades. I had traveled ceaselessly to find it, and Hamilton had found it sitting in the comfort of his chair, 30 miles outside Sydney and 8 feet from his ironing board. And this, it seemed to me, was a testament to the power of the internet and to this man's dogged skills as a researcher. I hadn't been taking notes during dinner because I didn't want to risk spooking him. I had long ago learned that subjects reluctant to give you information were allergic to notebooks and tape recorders. But I did not want to forget a single thing Hamilton was telling me. I was hopeful that with all this information, I could return to my room when he'd left and begin to plug in a host of new search terms in Google that would lead me where they'd led him. I excused myself and headed to the bathroom. On the way, I snatched a few cocktail napkins from the bar and locked myself inside a stall. There, I furiously wrote down everything Hamilton had just told me: obituary, Google Books, obscure journal, notorious Shapiro manuscript. I was in there a while, and some poor guy was knocking repeatedly at the door, desperate to get in. I was afraid that if I relinquished the stall, I'd lose my train of thought, and much of what Hamilton had said would disappear, so I kept on writing. When I was done, I flushed and opened the door, and a young kid pushed by me without making eye contact, head and shoulders bowed like he was walking into the wind. I stuffed the napkins into my back pocket and sat down at the table. So, Hamilton said, was it worth it, coming all the way to Australia? I didn't want to be rude. He just spent 3 hours with me, had made me a copy of his research, answered all of my questions. He'd been less forthcoming than I'd hoped and more than I reasonably could have expected. Also, I was growing increasingly convinced that maybe, just maybe, he'd already told me enough. So I demurred, mumbling something about how nice it was to finally meet him and to see his copious research firsthand. Then Hamilton excused himself to use the bathroom. As he rose from the table and walked toward the back of the room, I noticed that he had left his own unredacted research folder on the table, not 10 inches from my hand. My eyes shot up, searching the room. My heart kicked at my ribs. I felt like a pickpocket who had just spotted a rich lady's purse on a lunch counter. I couldn't believe he just left it sitting there. Maybe my earnest approach had worked. I had earned his trust, and now he felt comfortable enough to leave the binder behind. But what good was this trust if I didn't then use it to my advantage? And maybe he just didn't want to bring a binder into the bathroom. Or was this something else? Something, frankly, biblical. Maybe, I thought, Hamilton was testing me. I glanced around the room again to see if he was peeking at me from behind the wall by the bathroom. But he wasn't. Now I had a decision to make. Opening the binder was unquestionably the wrong thing to do, nothing short of stealing. And if I was to succeed in this search, I did not want to feel that the achievement was tainted. But I also knew that opening Hamilton's book could save me. I needed the name, and there it was, inches away. Salvation was at hand, and I was dithering. I knew that if I didn't grab the book, I would kick myself for days, weeks, forever. This was my job. To let it go to waste would be irresponsible. If I waited any longer, Hamilton would be back and the decision would be made for me. I was left with only my gut to guide me. Hamilton returned a couple of minutes later. Sitting back down, he set his hand gently on the binder's cover. I don't know if he was assessing its location or just using it for balance, but it hadn't moved. I hadn't touched it. But something in Hamilton's demeanor had changed. Now he began asking me questions. If you had the name, what would you do with it? When is the book due? When will it be published? I answered to the best of my ability, but the truth was the answers had much to do with him. If he gave me the name, my publisher might push back my deadline, allowing me the time to track down leads. I wasn't entirely sure what he was getting at with this new line of questioning, but my answers satisfied. Because then, 3.5 hours after we sat down to eat, 36 hours after I'd landed in Australia, and about 5,832 hours after he had first sent me an email inquiring into my research, Hamilton simply blurted it out. And I think I'll stop reading there.
That's such a great section of the book, Hanan. I loved that section when I got to it. I have so many questions and so many things that I want to talk with you about. One of the things that would be probably helpful for people to know in the audience is that the book toggles between a bunch of different time periods, right? We're in, I guess we start in about 1883. And then obviously we're in a contemporary situation when you're trying to search the book. And then we're also kind of in the Dead Sea Scroll period in Moab. No, I'm getting it wrong. That's in Utah.
No, you got it right.
I got it right.
Yeah.
We're in these different periods of time, and you make all of these characters as well as the actual document really come alive. And there are kind of good guys and bad guys, both in the contemporary situation, like, I don't know, a guy like Sabo is kind of your nemesis in a certain way inside the book. And
Yeah.
And Shapiro has nemesis is obviously Ginsburg, who declared it a fraud. But can you talk, Shapiro's a particularly interesting character in the book, obviously, since he's the inciter of all of this event, and he's a complicated character. And can you talk a little bit about your relationship to him as a character through the book?
Yes, I would love to. It's a great question.
Maybe it's a novelist's question, but
I mean, it is. That's why it's such a great question, because what I wanted to do here was actually, write a book that every word of it was completely true, and it all happened. I made nothing up, but that you could pick up and read and be engaged in it the way you would be in a novel. And that's a really hard thing to do, and that's especially hard to do when 80% of the characters died 100 years ago. And so you can't go and do what I would normally do as a journalist, which is, call them on the phone, or these days, get them on Zoom or something like that. And so what that meant was, one of the reasons I was traveling around the world so much was to gather up documents, letters, newspaper articles, whatever it was, anything that allowed me to glimpse into the mind of any of the characters that I was writing about. They were long gone. And when they wrote these letters, they never had in mind that some researcher from San Francisco State University a century later was going to be peeking into these letters. And as such, they were being completely themselves in these documents. They were just fully open. And it was documents like that that allowed me to really get an insight into who these people were, not just as characters, right, but as human beings. And that was particularly true of Shapiro himself, who is the hero or perhaps anti-hero of our story, depending how you look at it. You know, I went into it hearing from everyone Shapiro was a forger. And so I thought, okay, the guy's a rogue, right? He deceived loads of people because he wanted to make a lot of money. And what kind of person does that? But the more I dug into it, the more I read about him and the more I read from him, right, documents that he himself had written, the more I began to question the received wisdom about his being a forger, about the document being a forgery, the more I learned about his family, about his love for his wife, his love for his children, the fact that after he died, he left behind a widow and 2 orphaned children. I learned about him as a human being. And the fact of the matter is, I kind of fell in love with the guy a little bit. You know, you spend so much time with a person and you learn so much about them that it becomes how you get a bit of Stockholm syndrome, I think. And that was one of the things that really surprised me about the book, how much I came to really admire and like Shapiro in a way, because even if his manuscript turned out to be a forgery, it predicted the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? No one had ever seen a Dead Sea Scroll in 1883 when Shapiro came forward with this document. And yet somehow his Dead Sea Scroll seemed to, his scroll seemed to predict the Dead Sea Scroll. And what does that mean? It means to me that he was an insanely creative and clever and brilliant man. And so that itself made me sort of respect and admire him even more. And so the more I dug into it, the more I came to really appreciate who he was, not only as this sort of larger than life character, but also just as a normal guy, a man, a father, and a husband trying to make his way in the world.
Well, wasn't he also, just to pursue this a little bit further before I ask you another question, just to stick on him for a bit, he was pretty erudite. I mean, he had he had a business in Jerusalem, right, in which he dealt in antiquities, and they weren't all frauds. And he actually, even after, if I'm right in remembering this from your book, even after the fraud, he sold something else to the British Museum, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. You know, despite what had happened, he had sold them enough authentic material that was important enough before this whole scandal went down, that they were still interested in some of the material that he had. So yeah, he was indeed erudite. He was largely, it appears, an autodidact. We don't know much about what his life was like before he moved to Jerusalem. He lived in the Pale of Settlement. He probably had some kind of yeshiva background before he converted to Christianity. So, you know, he at least had a fairly solid grounding in Jewish literature. But, you know, the other side of that coin, Victoria, is that about 10 years before this scandal happened, Shapiro had gotten in trouble for selling 3,000 clay statuettes that were indeed supposedly from Moab, right? Moab, these pieces of Moabite culture that no one had ever discovered before. And he made a fortune selling them to the Royal Museum in Berlin. And those actually turned out to be fakes. They turned out to be forgeries. And so his reputation actually had been tainted previous to this, even though almost everyone at the time, and this was in about 1874, agreed that in that case, Shapiro wasn't himself the forger, but he had been duped into bringing these things into his collection and then going ahead and selling them. So that being said, you know, it had really helped his life quite a lot. He bought an incredible home in Jerusalem, which had been owned by the famous Nashashibi clan. After he died many years later, it became the home of Anna Ticho, who's a famous Israeli artist. He bought an ostrich with his money. I think it's the same way Michael Jackson had like a tiger in his Neverland Ranch. So Shapiro had an ostrich, which apparently had a very, very bad temper. So he had this mixed kind of reputation, but he was erudite enough, as you say, and had sold enough authentic material to important enough institutions around the world previously that although his reputation was largely destroyed, shortly after this scandal, they did buy another manuscript from him.
Let me ask you another question. One of the things that was so moving to me inside of the book. And there are a lot of pieces in the middle of this kind of Indiana Jones search in all directions that wind up being really quite moving to me. But one of them maybe is kind of my nerdy aspect of research. And I was struck, in the 1800s, there's this kind of quest for knowledge that drives people. It's still current quest in kind of the archaeology, deep into archaeology and into finding these relics. And so while that's happening in the contemporary world, there's you chasing the world and kind of doing a sort of contemporary archaeology of these pieces of information to find the Bible. But also I began to think about Google. I mean, certainly in the passage you read, that's a key piece, but it happens earlier in the book that I began to think about Google as a contemporary strata of archaeology. I kept being astonished by how much information you were finding that was actually on the web, like as if our whole world was something, you could just unbury by spending your life in a room on Google. Can you talk about sort of research, both the active, the flying around the world part of your research, which seemed to me like you had stamina, especially when you're hitting walls. I kept going, God, Hanan, you're going again to now nowhere. You're getting in a car, you get turned around from a border. So will you talk a little bit about all of that?
Yeah, well, I should say I had no children at the time when I began the research. So I did have stamina. That's no longer the case, I'm afraid. But yeah, I mean, the research, it was funny because in some way, I see myself as a writer, but in some way, once I sort of finished the research, I almost resented having to sit down and write the book. Because the research was so fun and the possibilities were utterly endless. And then at some point I had to say, okay, the research is over. Now you've got to sit down and write this. So yes, there is so much available on the web. And the passage I just read showed you, this thing that people have been searching for 100 years, a guy out in, suburbs of Sydney discovers it sitting in front of his computer. On the other hand, those discoveries are far less emotional than actually holding an artifact of some variety in your hand. So it's amazing to discover something on Google, but when I actually went to the British Museum and found there what amounted to Shapiro's suicide note, right? A note he wrote to Ginsburg saying, "You've ruined my reputation. How am I supposed to go on?" I held that in my hand, and that's an incredibly personal document. And it was really like an electrical jolt goes through your body. You've got this connection all of a sudden with this long gone person who you're growing to appreciate and respect. And so, I do fear that in this day and age, Molly, my wife, was just found this whole stash of old letters that she wrote and received when she was in high school and college. And we were both marveling at the fact that, like, that's never gonna happen again. Our children are not gonna have that, right? We're in touch with people in different ways now, by texts and emails. We don't have those physical objects anymore that really bring you back to a time and place, that really allow you to make this emotional connection with the person who actually sat with their pen and pulled out their paper and folded it up and licked the envelope and put the stamp on. And so I fear that we're, losing a bit of that connection to the past by our reliance on the incredible bounty that the internet offers us. So, for me, the more profound moments and the more emotional moments were the ones where I was actually not just interacting with people, but interacting with actual relics.
I love this. This is so interesting. I'm going to interrupt for a moment. This is such a fascinating discussion about the journalistic journey. And I feel like a real connection with you because, as a filmmaker, you're constantly like searching for these truths and then really falling in love with your stories, right? And the people and involved. Now, I'm going to give Victoria a moment to take a look at all these amazing questions that are coming in. And I'm going to take a moment to give a few upcoming announcements about our upcoming programs. So January 23rd, next Sunday, we have the Otto von Habsburg who was saved by Sousa Mendes. at 2 p.m. New York time. And he was the last crown prince of Austria and was on Hitler's enemy list. And he and his family were rescued by Sousa Mendes. And we're going to host a fascinating panel that day, including his daughter. She will be there as well. The Sunday after that, January 30th, 4 p.m., Hans and Sophie Scholl, the White Rose anti-Nazi resistance movement. Sophie was a German student, an anti-Nazi political activist, and a co-founder of the White Rose nonviolent resistance movement in Germany. Also, tomorrow you're going to be receiving an email from Olivia and the Sousa Mendes Foundation about an opportunity to distribute my documentary, Nobody Wants Us, to the educational institution of your choice. So stay tuned for that email. And last but certainly not least, February 13th at 4 p.m. New York time, Victoria is going to be talking about her book, Order of Truth. Stay tuned for that. Really good novel. Looking forward to hearing her read excerpts from that. And lastly, I feel like these events will inspire us and motivate us to, speak power to truth and live in Martin Luther King's footsteps of, standing up and stepping up for what's right. So now I would like to hand the floor back to you, Victoria, to take questions for the audience.
Great. Hanan, there's a whole lot of just praise for you and for your storytelling. So we're going to skip over that, but just take it in for a second.
Thank you.
One question that comes up that someone asks is, Shula Reinhardt says, I was fascinated by the very appearance of the document. It looks so different from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Do you know how scholars were able to decipher it? So that's just going into the weeds a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great question because the answer is totally bizarre. It looks like it's a piece of, burnt tree bark that you pull out of a fire, after a campfire, or maybe the spine of a really old book that falls off after many years or something. You can't see anything on it. According to reports from the time, the way both Shapiro and then Ginsburg afterwards, and I should say Ginsburg wrote a letter to his daughter after his work was done and saying he thinks it ruined his eyesight and it almost blinded him working on this thing because it was so illegible. But the way Shapiro worked on it and demonstrated what was there to the people at the British Museum when he first brought it to England, he would actually pour spirits, right, some kind of wine essentially, onto the manuscript and scrub at it with a brush. And because of whatever chemical reaction was going on there with the patina that was on top of the manuscript, the text would suddenly become visible for just a few moments before the spirits dried up. So you'd pour some on, scrub it, read it, get a couple of letters, take them down, let it dry up, pour some on, scrub it, read it, get a couple of letters. And they had to go through the entire document that way to see what they had on their hands. And so it was an incredibly arduous way of doing it. And it actually, at one point when Shapiro was demonstrating this to people, an entire bottle of spirits spilled out onto the manuscript. And he made nothing of it. And it shocked people at the time. They said, this is how he treats a manuscript that's supposed to be £1 million sterling. But it's quite bizarre. You cannot possibly imagine it happening nowadays, I don't think. And yet that's what happened.
Someone else asked, and this will link into that question, was the museum able to test the age of the ink on the scroll?
No. Unfortunately, they weren't. Nowadays, that would, of course, be one of the first things anyone would do. Although I will say, ink is incredibly hard to test the age because, it's very sort of complicated scientifically, but you can, it's very hard. Let's just say it's very hard to carbon date ink. You can, however, carbon date parchment or leather. So that's likely what they would have done at the time if they had the technology that we have nowadays. Unfortunately, they didn't have that technology then, and they couldn't have done that kind of testing. But of course, there's a flip side to the fact that we have that technology now, right? So it allows scientists to determine maybe what is a fraud, but it also allows criminals to use science and technology to actually perpetrate frauds, right? So for example, nowadays you could go onto eBay and buy a piece of actually ancient papyrus from Egypt that's being sold, a blank piece of papyrus, because we all have access to, eBay. And so you can get that. And then because ink is hard to date, you come up with the right potion, you scribble something out, and it's really hard to tell whether or not it's real or fake. And so you actually have to go back to using the very same methods that they used in 1883 to determine if it's real or fake. And that is largely epigraphy and paleography, which is to say, looking at the style of handwriting and determining if there are anomalies there that make it look like a fake, or if it really matches up with things we know to be authentic.
So another question that comes up is that sort of links into these sort of the larger questions of deceptions inside of it. The question reads, you hinted at deception in some people during your search. Could you say something more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there were a couple of people when I began the search, I quickly discovered that there was a sort of subculture of people who call themselves Shapiro maniacs. These are other people who are out there trying to find the manuscript and determine if it was real or fake. Many of them, extremely educated, very bright people who had been working on it for years. And so I felt like the new kid on the block. I had just begun doing it. There was an Israeli filmmaker who had been working, researching this for 30 years, I think, before, I finally, sent him an email. And so there was actually 2 Israeli filmmakers working on documentaries about Shapiro at the same time. One of whom agreed to work with me, and I thought it was great. Maybe I can, we can help each other out. He'll tell me what he knows, I'll tell him what I discover. What actually ended up happening is I told him what I discovered, and he didn't tell me what he knows. And so that relationship did not bear very much fruit. And then there was another documentary filmmaker who we initially started working together for, whatever reasons I didn't exactly know at the time. He sort of stopped working with me. And then it turned out ultimately he had asked Matthew Hamilton, he'd gotten in touch with him first and asked him not to share any information with me because he wanted to be the first one to come out with the name of the person who ultimately owned Shapiro's manuscript. And so there were all these sort of forces at work that I never anticipated when I began doing the work.
I want to ask a question. This is me jumping in with a question that comes out of something in the book that I think is pretty important. Because one of the kind of themes or takeaway themes that I were taking away was just the question of what is truth and what's artifice, and why it matters. And you actually come to this point in the book in which you ask that question, right? The fact that the story touches on a need that's fundamentally human. I'm quoting from your book, to search for truth, to hunt for that which is authentic, but why? And then you put the question to a bunch of people, and then you sort of answer it a little bit right here, but then I want to ask you to go further. I often ask myself why I searched. Everywhere I turned, evidence disappeared, fire destroyed scroll fragments, suitcases, sources refused to talk to me, pressured others to do the same. There were moments of elation, but also moments of massive frustration. Perhaps most vexing of all was the constant presence of doubt. Would I ever solve the question of the scroll's authenticity? So, I mean, I guess it brings me to why keep going, and what is that? What is the desire? Why is there this sort of need that we have to investigate these questions, which is sort of kind of a philosophical question that's inside your book?
Yeah, it is. And I don't know that I have a really good answer for it, to be honest with you. I'll tell you why I kept searching, I think. And not only the prosaic reason, which is that I'd gotten an advance for the book and couldn't pay it back at that point. So I had to keep going. So I mentioned briefly that my father was a Bible scholar. What I didn't mention was that his largest work to date is a commentary of about 600 pages on the book of Deuteronomy, which is the very book that got Shapiro into so much trouble. And growing up, the word Deuteronomy in my house was like, Dora the Explorer or something in other houses. We heard about it all the time because my father was doing research on it for 16 years, right? It was a really, really big deal in our family. So for me, the book Deuteronomy, the word Deuteronomy, loomed large in my consciousness. And then here comes this story where if the document in question is authentic, it's actually the very original version of the book of Deuteronomy which is not only extraordinary because of what I said before, right? Like to come in contact with a relic that Moses himself might have written down or dictated or touched. I mean, that's extraordinary. But for me, on the more personal level, it was the idea that imagine if I find this document and it's authentic and it's the original copy of this book that my father has spent so much of his life working on, that my family has spent so much of our lives thinking about and being involved with. And so that idea to me sort of, I had in my mind, I mean, it seems maybe a little silly, but like the idea of like, imagine like walking into their house and, you know, like a cat presents a mouse to its owner. I'd just be like, here it is, the original book of Deuteronomy. And so, you know, that was one reason, one thing that kept me going the whole time. And the truth is, both my parents were very involved the whole way through. I mean, I was on the phone with them constantly, checking things, asking questions. They were shooting around ideas. And so there's also something about, it's like having a deadline, right? I might not turn something in unless I have a deadline because there's other people out there waiting for this. So the idea that I was, you know, working with my parents on this and they were so deeply involved with it, I think that was another spur for me to keep on going. And the fact was, it's almost like, imagine you're watching Citizen Kane, and you stop like 5 minutes before he says, you know, Rosebud. It seems, you know, the human brain is not wired that way. We sort of need to get at the punchline. And so there was something about that also. And then, you know, the deeper question of why do we search for truth? I mean, it's sort of like, well, why do we exist on this planet if we don't search for truth? So I suppose that's my answer.
So many great questions in this that I'm seeing, and we have 3 minutes left, and I want to stay true, you know, stay in time. Can I get any final thoughts from each of you? Just a brief final thoughts. We have 2 minutes.
Ladies first.
Thanks, Anand. Well, this has been a complete pleasure for me, and it's, you know, it's so fun to think that I get to talk to you about your book, and then next month you get to talk to me about mine. And partly one of the things that kept occurring to me that as I reread your book, which is so different than my book's a novel, but they're both inquiries into what one wants to know and won't necessarily be able to find out. And, you know, it's why I came to this question about knowing and certainty, and whether it's on a larger level of being able to find that kind of document or have someone reveal something to you. And I just love the way inside of your book that occurs both on the level of individuals you meet who can withhold information or share information, and then also the quest to find it. And people have asked all sorts of questions like that they're going to have to find out now by reading the book. I'm looking at more questions that keep coming up, so they're going to have to order your book. But now I'll turn to you, Hanan.
Buy it early and buy it often, as I like to say.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Victoria. That's really interesting. And thank you so much for doing this. And I can't wait to turn the tables in a few weeks. So I think, you know, my final thought, maybe I'd actually like to speak just for a minute about the Sousa Mendes Foundation, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, as opposed to my book, just because, you know, I spent a lot of time with him also, another person who sadly has been gone a very long time, but I, you know, spent, you know, months and months traipsing around the world trying to understand who he was as a person. And just to say that it's a great honor to be doing an event in association with the Sousa Mendes Foundation, because I think Aristides de Sousa Mendes can be an example to us all today. And in a, you know, a day and age where I think we need heroes, we need people to stand up and do what's right, even in the face of great, you know, personal danger. That's exactly what he did. And that's extremely meaningful for me. I learned a lot. I sort of wish I could be more like him. And so, yeah, that would be my final thought, is it's just that he's, you know, the man who is the namesake of the organization that put together this event is someone we can all really, really look to as an example of maybe how to live our lives. I know I try to do it.
Wonderful words to end on, for sure. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Hanan. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you, Laura.
See you all next time.
Thanks very much for coming, everybody. Thanks, Victoria.
Thanks, Hanan.